The betting started before Staff Sergeant Elena Castellanos finished her first bite of meatloaf. $20, says she cries before we're done, Private Trevor Buchanan whispered to his companion, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. The other recruits laughed and nodded, already imagining their easy victory as they approached her isolated corner table in the mess hall. Elena kept her eyes on her tray, methodically cutting another piece of meat while 5 sets of boots surrounded her chair. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across the linoleum floor, and the usual dinner chatter from other tables seemed to fade as curious eyes turned toward the developing confrontation. She wore standard fatigues with no visible rank insignia, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun that revealed nothing of the steel beneath her calm exterior. "You sitting in our spot, sweetheart," Buchanan announced, his voice carrying that particular arrogance that came with 3 months of basic training and 0 real experience. Private Marcus Hendricks stepped closer, close enough that his shadow fell across her plate. "Maybe you didn't get the memo about where support staff should eat." The nearby tables had gone completely quiet now. 17 pairs of eyes watched the scene unfold, most expecting to witness the usual harassment that happened when cocky recruits decided to pick on someone they perceived as weaker. Gunnery Sergeant Patricia Clearwater glanced up from her own meal 2 tables away, her expression already preparing to witness another unfortunate display of recruit behavior that she would have to address later through proper channels. Elena took another careful bite, chewing slowly while Buchanan leaned down closer to her ear. His breath smelled like stale coffee and the cheap cigarettes he thought nobody knew about. "You know what I think?" he continued, his voice dropping to what he probably considered a threatening whisper. "I think you wandered into the wrong building. This is where real soldiers eat." Private Cole Ramirez circled around to her other side, emboldened by the lack of response. His combat boots squeaked against the wax floor as he positioned himself to block any potential escape route. "Look at her, just sitting there," he said to the group, his voice loud enough to reach the farthest corners of the mess hall. "Probably thinking if she ignores us long enough, we'll just go away." The fork in Elena's hand remained steady as she reached for her water glass, taking a slow sip while her peripheral vision tracked each recruit's position with the precision of someone who had learned long ago that survival depended on constant awareness. Her pulse stayed even, her breathing controlled, while around her the 5 young men continued their performance for their growing audience. Private Justin Kovac stepped forward, clearly the most aggressive of the group, his chest puffed out like a bantam rooster as he leaned over her shoulder. "Maybe she's deaf," he suggested loudly. "Maybe that's why she got stuck in some cushy support role instead of doing real military work like the rest of us." Before we dive into this story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've seen similar situations at military bases in your area. The comments seemed to break whatever restraint the 5th recruit, Private Danny Thornfield, had been maintaining. He moved to complete their circle, his young face twisted with the kind of cruel excitement that came from being part of a pack mentality. His hand reached out toward her shoulder, fingers extended to grab the fabric of her uniform shirt. "You listening to us?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly with nervous energy. "When real soldiers are talking to you, you're supposed to pay attention." Elena set down her fork with deliberate care, the small metallic sound somehow carrying more weight than all their shouting combined. Her hands rested calmly on either side of her tray, while her dark eyes slowly lifted to meet Buchanan's gaze. The temperature in the mess hall seemed to drop several degrees, as those who knew how to read such signs recognized something shifting in the atmosphere around the corner table. Sergeant Clearwater's hand paused halfway to her mouth, her instincts suddenly screaming that this situation was about to become something entirely different from what anyone expected. The betting conversations at nearby tables died completely as seasoned personnel began to sense that they were witnessing the calm before a very particular kind of storm. "You have about 5 seconds to step back," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that experienced soldiers learn to recognize and respect. Her tone held no anger, no fear, no pleading. Just a simple statement of fact delivered with the precision of someone who had given similar warnings in far more dangerous circumstances than a military mess hall. Buchanan laughed, the sound harsh and grating in the sudden silence. "Or what?" he sneered, leaning even closer until his face was inches from hers. "You go to report us to the commanding officer. Tell them the big mean recruits hurt your feelings." The other 4 recruits chuckled along with their leader, completely missing the way Elena's shoulders had shifted almost imperceptibly, the subtle repositioning of her feet beneath the table, the minute change in her breathing that transformed her from a woman eating dinner into something far more dangerous. Around them, the mess hall held its collective breath as those with enough experience began to recognize the signs of someone who was about to demonstrate exactly why assumptions could be fatal mistakes. The 5 seconds Elena had offered came and went like smoke in the wind. Buchanan straightened up slowly, making a show of rolling his shoulders and cracking his knuckles while his companion spread out in a wider circle around her chair. The sound of his joints popping echoed in the unnatural quiet that had settled over the mess hall like a heavy blanket. "She's making threats now," Hendricks announced to the room, his voice pitched loud enough to reach every corner. "Did everyone hear that? Little Miss Support Staff thinks she can intimidate real soldiers with her tough talk." Elena returned to her meal with the same methodical precision she had maintained throughout the harassment. Her knife moved through the meatloaf in even slices while her peripheral vision cataloged every shift in their positions, every tell that revealed their next moves. 20 years of training had taught her to read aggression the way meteorologists read storm systems, and she could feel the pressure building around her table with scientific accuracy. Ramirez stepped closer, his boot actually bumping against her chair leg. "Maybe she didn't hear us clearly the first time," he suggested, his young voice trying to project menace, but coming across more like a teenager attempting to intimidate his math teacher. "Let me speak slower so she can follow along." The audience of soldiers at surrounding tables had grown larger as word spread through the mess hall that something interesting was developing in the corner. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez paused in the doorway with his dinner tray, taking in a scene with the practiced eye of someone who had broken up more than his share of confrontations. His instincts told him to intervene, but something about the woman's absolute stillness made him hesitate. Kovac reached down and flicked the edge of Elena's water glass, sending small ripples across the surface. "When someone talks to you in the military," he explained with exaggerated patience, "you're supposed to respond. It's called respect for the chain of command." Elena took another sip of water, her movements so controlled they seemed choreographed. The glass returned to its exact position on her tray, while her dark eyes remained focused on her meal. Her silence wasn't submission or fear, though the recruits interpreted it that way. It was the silence of a predator conserving energy before the strike. Thornfield grew bolder, emboldened by what he perceived as her weakness. He moved around behind her chair, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. His hand hovered just above her shoulder, fingers twitching with the desire to make physical contact that would cross the line from harassment into assault. "You know what your problem is," he announced to the room, playing to his audience of fellow recruits who had gathered at nearby tables to watch the show. "You think because you wear the uniform, that makes you one of us. But real soldiers earn their place through strength and courage, not by hiding behind paperwork and kitchen duty." Sergeant Clearwater finally stood up from her table, her chair scraping against the floor with a sharp sound that cut through the tension. Her years of experience screamed that this situation was about to escalate beyond simple harassment, and every instinct told her to shut it down before someone got seriously hurt. But as she took her first step toward the confrontation, Elena spoke again. "Last warning," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying the same deadly calm as before. Her hands remained relaxed on either side of her tray, but those with combat experience could see the subtle changes in her posture that indicated she was no longer simply enduring their harassment. She was preparing to end it. Buchanan laughed again, the sound even more grating than before. "Oh, we're really scared now," he announced to his companions. The little lady is giving us last warnings. What's next? Are you going to tell us you know karate? The other recruits joined in his laughter, completely oblivious to the fact that several seasoned personnel around the room had suddenly become very alert. Master Sergeant Williams, a 25-year veteran who had seen combat in 3 different theaters, slowly lowered his coffee cup and turned his full attention to the corner table. Something about the woman's absolute stillness reminded him of moments in firefights when experienced soldiers prepared to do violence with surgical precision. Hendricks reached out and deliberately knocked Elena's fork off her tray. The metallic clatter as it hit the floor somehow sounding like a starting pistol in the charged atmosphere. "There," he said with satisfaction. "Now you'll have to look at us when you ask for another one." Elena's head turned slowly, her dark eyes lifting to meet his gaze with the kind of direct attention that made him suddenly uncomfortable. For just a moment, Hendricks caught a glimpse of something in those eyes that made his bravado falter. It was like looking into the eyes of a wolf that had been pretending to be a house cat. "Pick it up," Ramirez demanded, pointing at the fallen fork. "And while you're down there, maybe you can apologize for wasting our time with your attitude." The temperature in the mess hall seemed to plummet as Elena slowly pushed back her chair and stood up. She moved with the fluid grace of someone whose body was a perfectly calibrated weapon, every motion economical and precise. At 5 feet 6 inches, she was smaller than any of the recruits surrounding her, but something about her presence made the space around her seem to expand. Sergeant Clearwater stopped mid-stride, her hand instinctively moving toward her radio as she recognized the signs of someone who was about to demonstrate exactly why assumptions could be fatal. Around the room, conversations died completely as every experienced soldier suddenly understood that they were about to witness something that would be talked about for years to come. Elena stood slowly, her movements so controlled it seemed to unfold in slow motion. The chair rolled back exactly 18 inches before coming to a perfect stop, as if even furniture responded to her precise command. The 5 recruits instinctively stepped back half a pace, suddenly aware that the dynamics of their confrontation had shifted in ways they couldn't quite comprehend. Buchanan recovered first, puffing out his chest to compensate for the momentary uncertainty that had flickered across his face. "Look at that," he announced to the room with forced bravado. "Now she's trying to intimidate us by standing up. What's next? Are you going to tower over us with your impressive 5'6" frame?" The laughter from his companions sounded strained now, lacking the confident cruelty that had marked their earlier harassment. Hendricks glanced around the mess hall, suddenly noticing how many experienced personnel had turned their full attention to their corner. The weight of those seasoned eyes made him shift uncomfortably, though he couldn't articulate why veteran soldiers watching should make him nervous. Elena bent down slowly to retrieve her fallen fork, her movement fluid and purposeful. As she straightened, Thornfield made his fatal mistake. His hand shot out to grab her shoulder, fingers closing on the fabric of her uniform shirt with the aggressive confidence of someone who had never encountered real resistance. The moment his hand made contact, Elena's entire demeanor shifted like a switch being thrown. The calm, patient woman who had endured their harassment vanished, replaced by something that made the air itself seem to vibrate with potential energy. Her dark eyes locked onto Thornfield's face with laser intensity, and for the first time, he saw exactly what Master Sergeant Williams had recognized from across the room. "Remove your hand," Elena said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent mess hall. The words weren't a request or a plea. They were a final offer of mercy, delivered with the kind of absolute certainty that came from someone who knew exactly how the next 30 seconds would unfold if her warning went unheeded. Thornfield's grip tightened instead of releasing, his young face flushing red with the kind of aggressive stupidity that ended military careers and sometimes lives. "You don't give orders here," he snarled, pulling her closer with enough force to make a normal person stumble. "We tell you what to do, and right now I'm telling you to shut up and listen." Around the mess hall, Chairs scraped against linoleum as experienced soldiers unconsciously prepared for violence. Sergeant Clearwater reached for her radio, while simultaneously calculating how long it would take her to cross the distance to the confrontation. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez set down his tray and started moving toward the corner table, though some instinct warned him he might already be too late to prevent what was coming. Ramirez stepped closer, emboldened by Thornfield's physical contact. "Maybe we need to teach you some respect the hard way," he suggested, his voice cracking slightly with nervous energy. His hand moved toward Elena's other arm, fingers extended to grab and restrain her while his companions delivered whatever lesson they thought she needed. Elena's response came with the explosive suddenness of a lightning strike. Her left hand moved in a precise arc that broke Thornfield's grip while simultaneously striking a nerve cluster that sent numbing shock waves up his entire arm. Before he could even register the pain, her right elbow drove backward into his solar plexus with surgical accuracy, folding him over like a broken lawn chair. The fork in her hand became an improvised weapon as she spun toward Ramirez, the metal tines stopping exactly 1 inch from his left eye. He froze completely, suddenly understanding that he was looking at someone who could blind him permanently before he could even think about defending himself. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he stared cross-eyed at the implement that had transformed from eating utensil to precision instrument of violence. Kovac lunged forward, thinking he could overwhelm her while she was occupied with his companions. His mistake became apparent when Elena's foot swept his legs with the kind of textbook precision that drill instructors spent months trying to teach. He hit the linoleum hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs in a whooshing gasp that echoed through the silent mess hall. Hendricks and Buchanan found themselves staring at a woman who had disabled 3 of their companions in approximately 4 seconds using movements so efficient they seemed choreographed. The easy victim they had surrounded moments before had vanished, replaced by someone whose mere presence radiated the kind of controlled lethality that separated elite operators from ordinary soldiers. The silence in the mess hall was deafening. 17 pairs of eyes watched in stunned disbelief as Elena stood calmly among the scattered recruits, her breathing still perfectly controlled while her attackers gasped and wheezed around her feet. The fork remained steady in her hand, positioned with casual precision that suggested she could put it anywhere she chose with devastating accuracy. Master Sergeant Williams slowly stood up from his table, recognition dawning across his weathered features as he processed what he had just witnessed. Those weren't random self-defense moves or lucky strikes. They were the precise, efficient techniques of someone with advanced military training, delivered with the kind of muscle memory that came from years of constant practice and real-world application. Sergeant Clearwater stopped her forward progress, suddenly understanding that intervention was no longer necessary. The situation had resolved itself with a kind of swift, decisive action that left no doubt about who held the real power in this confrontation. Around the room, seasoned personnel began to reassess everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman who had been eating dinner alone in the corner. The fork remained perfectly steady in Elena's hand as she turned her attention to the 2 recruits still standing. Hendricks and Buchanan stood frozen like deer caught in headlights, their earlier bravado evaporating as they processed the clinical efficiency with which their companions had been neutralized. Around their feet, Thornfield clutched his midsection while gasping for air. Ramirez remained statue still with the fork inches from his eye, and Kovac groaned softly from his position on the linoleum floor. Buchanan's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound, his brain struggling to reconcile what he had witnessed with everything he thought he knew about the woman they had cornered. His hands trembled slightly as the full implications of their mistake began to dawn on him. The confident leader who had initiated this confrontation was rapidly being replaced by a very young man who suddenly understood he was completely out of his depth. Elena's voice cut through the silence with the same deadly calm she had maintained throughout the harassment. "You have approximately 10 seconds to help your friends to their feet and walk away," she said, her tone carrying no anger or satisfaction, just the matter-of-fact delivery of someone stating an obvious truth. "The alternative is that I demonstrate additional techniques that will require medical attention." Hendricks took a shaky step backward, his face pale as he watched Elena's effortless control of the situation. 3 of his companions lay disabled around her, yet she showed no signs of exertion or stress. Her breathing remained even, her posture relaxed, as if neutralizing multiple attackers was no more taxing than finishing her dinner. The realization that she could have seriously injured all of them, but had chosen restraint, made him feel sick to his stomach. Master Sergeant Williams approached slowly, his hands visible and non-threatening as he moved within speaking distance. His 25 years of military experience had taught him to recognize elite operators, and everything about Elena's movements screamed advanced training. The precise strikes, the economy of motion, the way she maintained total situational awareness while engaging multiple targets, all pointed to someone with far more than basic self-defense knowledge. "Ma'am," Williams said respectfully, his voice carrying the kind of deference that made several nearby soldiers look up in surprise. "I believe there may have been a misunderstanding here. These recruits were obviously unaware of your background and training." Elena's eyes shifted to Williams without moving her head, maintaining visual contact with the remaining threats while acknowledging his presence. The fork never wavered from his position near Ramirez's eye, though her grip remained relaxed and controlled. "There was no misunderstanding, Sergeant," she replied quietly. "These men chose to escalate a situation through verbal harassment and then physical assault. I simply responded appropriately to the threat they presented." Buchanan finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a croak. "We didn't know," he whispered, his earlier arrogance completely absent. "We thought you were just support staff. We didn't mean for this to happen." The look Elena gave him could have frozen water in July. "Your assumptions about my role or capabilities don't excuse harassment, assault, or any other behavior that violates military standards and basic human decency," she said, each word delivered with the precision of a scalpel. "The fact that you chose to target someone you perceive as weak makes your actions worse, not better." Sergeant Clearwater finally reached the group, her radio crackling with requests for status updates from security personnel who had heard the initial call. Her eyes swept over the scene, taking in the 3 disabled recruits and the 2 still standing in obvious shock. The professional part of her mind was already calculating paperwork and disciplinary actions, but the soldier in her felt a grim satisfaction at seeing bullies face consequences for their actions. Ramirez remained perfectly still, sweat now running freely down his face as he stared cross-eyed at the fork that could blind him with the slightest pressure. His earlier confidence had been replaced by the kind of terror that came from understanding exactly how much mercy he was being shown. The woman holding his fate in her hands could have driven the implement into his eye socket the moment he moved to grab her, but instead she had chosen to demonstrate control and restraint. Elena slowly withdrew the fork, allowing Ramirez to stumble backward until he collapsed into a nearby chair. His hands shook as he raised them to his face, checking to make sure his vision was intact while trying to process how quickly their harassment had transformed into a lesson in combat superiority. The metallic taste of fear filled his mouth as he realized how close he had come to permanent injury. Thornfield finally managed to straighten up, though he kept one arm wrapped around his midsection where Elena's elbow had found its target. His face had gone gray with pain and shock, and when he looked at her now, there was none of the contempt or aggression that had marked his earlier behavior. Instead, there was the wide-eyed respect of someone who had encountered a force far beyond his understanding. Kovac rolled over slowly, testing his limbs for serious damage while trying to comprehend how someone half his size had put him on the ground with what felt like minimal effort. His legs tingled where a sweep had connected, and he suspected he would be feeling the impact for several days. The easy target they had thought to intimidate had revealed herself to be something far more dangerous than any of them had imagined. Around the mess hall, Conversations began to resume in hushed whispers as personnel tried to process what they had witnessed. Experienced soldiers exchanged meaningful glances, recognizing the signs of advanced combat training even if they couldn't identify the specific techniques that had been employed. The word spread quickly through the room that the quiet woman eating alone in the corner was far more than she appeared to be. Elena calmly set the fork back on her tray and returned to her seat, smoothing her uniform with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout the encounter. Her meal sat exactly where she had left it, though it had undoubtedly grown cold during the confrontation. She picked up her knife and resumed cutting her meatloaf as if nothing had happened, though everyone in the room understood that everything had changed. Master Sergeant Williams cleared his throat respectfully, his weathered hands clasped behind his back in the posture of someone addressing a superior. "Ma'am, if I may ask, what unit are you assigned to?" The question carried weight beyond simple curiosity. His tone held the careful deference of a veteran who suspected he was speaking to someone whose credentials far exceeded his own. Elena looked up from her methodical cutting, her dark eyes meeting William's gaze with calm assessment. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth as she considered how much information to reveal. Around them, the mess hall had grown unnaturally quiet again, with dozens of ears straining to catch her response while trying to appear disinterested in the conversation. "I'm currently between assignments," she replied simply, offering nothing more than the basic facts. Her voice carried the kind of neutral tone that experienced military personnel recognized as someone comfortable with classified information and operational security. The non-answer told Williams everything he needed to know about asking further questions in a public setting. Sergeant Clearwater approached with her clipboard, though her usual brisk efficiency seemed tempered by newfound uncertainty about exactly who she was dealing with. The disciplinary paperwork that had seemed straightforward moments before now felt considerably more complex. Her pen hovered over the incident report as she struggled with how to categorize what had transpired. "Staff Sergeant," she began carefully, addressing Elena with the rank visible on her uniform, though something in the woman's bearing suggested the insignia might not tell the complete story. "I need to document this incident for my report. Would you prefer to handle this through normal channels, or should I contact someone from your chain of command?" Elena's slight smile held no warmth, though it wasn't directed at Clearwater personally. These recruits initiated harassment, escalated to physical assault, and received an appropriate response, she said, her tone making clear that she considered the matter closed. Any disciplinary action should focus on their behavior, not the consequences they brought upon themselves. Buchanan shifted nervously from foot to foot, his earlier arrogance replaced by the kind of sick realization that came with understanding he had potentially destroyed his military career in the span of 30 seconds. His hands trembled as he watched Elena return to her meal with the same calm precision she had maintained throughout their confrontation. The woman who had just dismantled 3 of his companions seemed utterly unaffected by the violence she had employed. Hendricks stared at Elena's profile, trying to reconcile the efficient warrior he had witnessed with a quiet figure, now cutting her meatloaf into precise portions. The disconnect between her apparent role and demonstrated capabilities made his head spin. Support staff didn't move like that, didn't strike with that kind of surgical precision, didn't maintain such complete control while engaging multiple attackers simultaneously. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez finally reached the group, having crossed the mess hall with the deliberate pace of someone who had seen enough violence to recognize its aftermath. His eyes swept over the 3 recruits still recovering from their encounter, taking in their pale faces and shaky movements with the practiced assessment of a combat veteran. When his gaze settled on Elena, something in his expression shifted to recognition. "Ghost," he said quietly, the single word carrying enough weight to make several nearby soldiers look up sharply. Elena's hand paused for just a moment before she continued eating, neither confirming nor denying the identification. Rodriguez nodded slowly, pieces of a puzzle falling into place as he connected the woman before him with stories he had heard whispered in veteran circles. The 5 recruits exchanged confused glances, the call sign meaning nothing to them, but clearly carrying significance for the experienced personnel gathering around their table. Thornfield clutched his ribs more tightly, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead as he began to suspect that their mistake had been far worse than simple harassment of a fellow soldier. Williams stepped back respectfully, his posture shifting to something approaching attention as Rodriguez's identification sank in. 25 years of service had taught him to recognize the kind of operators who earned legendary reputations through actions that were rarely discussed in official reports. The efficient violence he had witnessed suddenly made perfect sense within a very different context. Kovacs struggled to his feet, using a nearby chair for support as his legs still trembled from the impact with the floor. His young face had gone ashen as he processed the implications of the exchanged glances between senior personnel. The woman they had cornered wasn't just any soldier. She was someone whose very presence commanded immediate respect from veterans who had seen everything the military had to offer. Elena took another careful bite, chewing slowly while the weight of recognition settled over the surrounding tables. Her calm consumption of dinner, while 5 chastened recruits stood nearby like scolded children, created a surreal tableau that would be discussed in hushed conversations for months to come. The message was clear without being stated. She had more important things to do than concern herself with their bruised egos and bodies. Ramirez remained seated, his hands still shaking as he replayed those terrifying seconds when the fork had hovered inches from his eye. The casual precision with which she had positioned the makeshift weapon suggested a familiarity with violence that went far beyond basic training or even standard combat instruction. He was beginning to understand that they had attempted to intimidate someone who could have ended all of their military careers with a few precise movements. Clearwater closed her clipboard with a sharp snap, her decision made. She would write this up as a training incident, emphasizing the recruits' inappropriate behavior and the valuable lesson in respect and situational awareness they had received. The alternative, a detailed investigation into exactly who Elena was and what techniques she had employed, would likely raise questions that nobody wanted answered in official documents. The silence stretched on as Elena finished another bite, the mundane act of eating somehow more intimidating than any threat she could have made. Around her, 5 young men who had thought themselves predators just minutes before stood like chastened children, finally beginning to comprehend the magnitude of their error in judgment and the mercy they had been shown despite their actions. The whispered conversations began at the far end of the mess hall and rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. "Ghost," someone repeated quietly, the call sign passing from table to table as veteran personnel exchanged meaningful glances and younger soldiers leaned forward to catch fragments of hushed explanations. The name carried weight in certain circles, attached to stories that were never officially documented but lived on in the oral tradition of elite operators. Buchanan's face had gone completely white as he overheard Senior Chief Petty Officer Martinez explain to a confused corporal exactly what ghost meant in Navy SEAL communities. His knees felt weak as the full scope of their catastrophic mistake became clear. They hadn't just harassed a fellow soldier. They had cornered and assaulted one of the most elite operators in the United States military, someone whose reputation was built on missions that would never appear in any public record. Elena continued eating with the same methodical precision, seemingly oblivious to the growing recognition around her, though her peripheral vision tracked every movement and conversation within a 20-foot radius. Her apparent focus on her meal was a professional courtesy, allowing the assembled personnel to process the situation without feeling directly observed or judged by someone whose capabilities they were only beginning to understand. Thornfield sank into a nearby chair, his injured ribs forgotten as the magnitude of what had transpired settled over him like a lead blanket. Stories filtered through his consciousness, fragments of conversations he had dismissed as exaggerated war stories when older soldiers spoke in reverent whispers about operators who moved through enemy territory like smoke, eliminating targets with surgical precision before vanishing without a trace. Master Sergeant Williams stepped closer to Rodriguez, his voice barely audible as he sought confirmation of what he suspected. "Is that really her?" he asked, his weathered features reflecting a mixture of awe and concern. "The woman from the Kandahar extraction. The one who brought out Senator Morrison's son when everyone said it was impossible." Rodriguez nodded slowly, his own expression grave as he watched Elena take another careful bite. "3 Taliban strongholds," he whispered back, his voice carrying the weight of classified information that had filtered down through unofficial channels. 48 hours behind enemy lines with no backup. 17 confirmed kills and 0 casualties on our side. They still don't know how she got past their outer perimeter. The 5 recruits stood frozen as these whispered revelations reached their ears, each new detail adding another layer to their growing horror. Kovac's legs finally gave out completely, and he collapsed into a chair with the boneless drop of someone whose nervous system had simply stopped functioning. The woman they had thought to intimidate with their numbers and aggression was someone who had single-handedly accomplished missions that entire platoons couldn't complete. Hendricks found himself staring at Elena's hands as she cut her meatloaf, trying to reconcile those slender fingers with the stories filtering through the mess hall about precision kills made at impossible distances and hand-to-hand combat that left enemy operatives unconscious without permanent damage. The fork that had threatened Ramirez's eyes suddenly seemed less like an improvised weapon and more like a precision instrument in the hands of someone who could weaponize anything within reach. Sergeant Clearwater closed her eyes briefly, realizing that her incident report would require careful wording to avoid raising questions about why a Navy SEAL was eating alone in a regular mess hall without escort or obvious security presence. The implications of Elena's unguarded accessibility suggested either supreme confidence in her abilities or a mission profile that required her to maintain a low profile among regular military personnel. Elena finally looked up from her meal, her dark eyes sweeping across the 5 recruits with the same calm assessment she had maintained throughout their confrontation. The weight of her attention made each of them feel suddenly exposed, as if she could read their entire military records and personal histories with a single glance. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to giving orders that determine life and death outcomes. "You have a choice to make," she said simply, her tone devoid of anger or vindictiveness, but carrying unmistakable finality. "You can learn from this experience and become better soldiers, or you can continue down the path that brought you here tonight. The military doesn't have room for people who target those they perceive as weak, and the real world has even less tolerance for such behavior." Buchanan tried to speak, his voice cracking as he attempted to form words that might somehow undo the last 30 minutes of his life. "We're sorry," he managed to whisper, though the apology sounded hollow even to his own ears. "We didn't know. We never would have. If we had realized who you were." Elena's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested that his words had missed the point entirely. "The problem isn't that you didn't know who I was," she replied quietly. "The problem is that you thought it was acceptable to behave that way toward anyone. My identity doesn't determine whether harassment and assault are wrong. Your actions would have been equally inappropriate regardless of who was sitting in this chair." The truth of her words hit the 5 recruits like physical blows, each syllable exposing the fundamental character flaws that had led them to this moment. Around them, the mess hall had grown completely silent as everyone within earshot absorbed the lesson being delivered with surgical precision. Elena wasn't just addressing her attackers. She was providing a masterclass in military values and personal integrity that would be remembered by everyone present. Ramirez finally found the courage to look directly at Elena, though he had to fight every instinct that screamed at him to avoid eye contact with a predator. "I understand," he said quietly, his voice barely audible, but carrying genuine remorse. "We were wrong. Completely wrong. Not just about you, but about everything we did tonight." Elena nodded slightly, the first sign of approval she had shown since the confrontation began. "Understanding is the first step," she replied, her tone suggesting that redemption might be possible for those willing to do the difficult work of genuine change. But understanding without action is worthless. You'll need to prove that this lesson actually took root, not just to me, but to every soldier who witnessed what happened here tonight. The entrance to the mess hall opened with a sharp sound that cut through the hushed conversations, and Colonel James Hartwell stepped inside with the purposeful stride of someone who had received urgent radio traffic about an incident requiring immediate attention. His weathered face scanned the room, taking in the unusual silence and the cluster of personnel gathered around the corner table where Elena sat calmly, finishing her meal. Senior Chief Martinez approached the colonel with visible unease, his normally confident demeanor replaced by the careful posture of someone delivering news that would complicate an already delicate situation. "Sir," he began quietly, "we have a situation that requires your immediate attention. There was an incident involving 5 recruits and a Navy SEAL who was dining alone." Colonel Hartwell's expression shifted immediately from routine concern to sharp focus. His eyes swept the mess hall again, this time cataloging the body language of the assembled personnel and the obvious signs of a confrontation that had already been resolved. The presence of so many senior enlisted personnel around a single table suggested that whatever had occurred was far from a typical disciplinary matter. Elena looked up as the colonel approached, her dark eyes meeting his gaze with the calm recognition of someone accustomed to explaining unusual situations to commanding officers. She made no move to stand or offer military courtesies, a breach of protocol that would have been shocking from anyone else, but somehow seemed entirely appropriate given the circumstances surrounding her presence. "Colonel," Elena said simply, her voice carrying the easy familiarity of someone who regularly interacted with senior officers in contexts that transcended normal military hierarchy. "I apologize for the disturbance to your facility. These recruits required immediate correction of their behavior, and I provided it through the most efficient means available." Hartwell studied the 5 young men clustered nearby, noting their pale faces and obvious signs of physical discomfort. Buchanan stood with his shoulders hunched in defeat, while Thornfield remained seated with one arm wrapped protectively around his midsection. The other 3 displayed the kind of shell-shocked expressions he had seen on soldiers after their first real combat experience. Master Sergeant Williams stepped forward to provide context, his voice low but clear enough for the colonel to hear every detail. "Sir, these recruits surrounded Staff Sergeant Castellanos during dinner and initiated verbal harassment that escalated to physical assault. She responded with minimal force necessary to neutralize the threat and provided them with a valuable lesson in military bearing and respect." The colonel's eyebrows rose slightly at the formal identification, though his expression remained carefully neutral. He had heard enough briefings about special operations personnel to understand that their presence in regular facilities often involved circumstances that were best handled with discretion and minimal official documentation. The fact that Elena had been eating alone without obvious security suggested operational parameters he wasn't clear to know about. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached cautiously, his identification of Elena as Ghost having created ripple effects throughout the veteran community present in the mess hall. "Sir," he said quietly, "I believe this individual may require special handling protocols. Her background suggests this incident should be classified under training and development rather than disciplinary action." Elena finished her last bite of meatloaf and set down her utensils with the same precise movements she had maintained throughout the entire encounter. "Gentlemen," she said, addressing the assembled senior personnel, while her words clearly included the 5 recruits, this was a learning opportunity for everyone involved. These young soldiers discovered the consequences of poor judgment, and everyone else received a demonstration of why assumptions can be dangerous. Colonel Hartwell nodded slowly, his experienced mind already calculating how to document an incident involving a Navy SEAL who technically outranked most of the personnel present, but was operating under circumstances that defied normal chain of command protocols. The complexity of the situation required delicate handling, to avoid raising questions that nobody wanted answered in official reports. Thornfield finally found the courage to speak, his voice hoarse with pain and genuine remorse. "Colonel, sir, we accept full responsibility for our actions." Staff Sergeant Castellanos showed remarkable restraint in her response to our completely inappropriate behavior. "We understand that we have brought dishonor to ourselves and this facility through our conduct." The formal acknowledgement of fault seemed to satisfy some requirement that Elena had been waiting for. She stood gracefully, her movement fluid and controlled as she gathered her tray and prepared to leave. The simple act of clearing her place somehow commanded more attention than any speech or demonstration could have achieved. Buchanan stepped forward hesitantly, his young face reflecting the kind of genuine shame that suggested real learning had occurred. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his earlier arrogance completely absent, "we want you to know that this experience has taught us things that no amount of training could have provided. We will be better soldiers because of what happened here tonight." Elena paused in her preparation to leave, studying each of the 5 recruits with the kind of assessment that seemed to peer directly into their characters. Her expression remained neutral, but something in her posture suggested cautious approval of their apparent understanding. "Time will tell whether you've actually learned anything," she replied simply. "Actions speak louder than apologies, and your future behavior will determine whether this was a valuable lesson or just temporary embarrassment." Hendricks nodded eagerly, desperate to demonstrate his comprehension of the opportunity they had been given. "We understand, ma'am. We know that we need to prove ourselves through our conduct going forward. This won't happen again, and we'll make sure other recruits understand the standards of respect and professionalism required in military service." The colonel watched this exchange with growing appreciation for how Elena had transformed a potentially serious disciplinary incident into a powerful teaching moment. Her handling of the situation had avoided paperwork, prevented long-term consequences for 5 young soldiers, and delivered a lesson that would resonate throughout the base for months to come. Elena walked toward the exit with the same unhurried pace she had maintained throughout the evening, her presence somehow filling the space around her despite her modest stature. Behind her, the mess hall remained unnaturally quiet as everyone processed what they had witnessed and the implications of her demonstrated capabilities. As she reached the door, Colonel Hartwell called out respectfully, "Staff Sergeant, thank you for handling this matter with such professionalism. Your restraint and wisdom in dealing with these recruits reflects the highest standards of military service." Elena paused at the threshold, looking back over the assembled personnel with eyes that seemed to catalog every face and expression. "The military succeeds when experienced soldiers teach younger ones to be better than they were," she replied quietly. "Tonight was just part of that continuous process of improvement that makes our forces strong." The door closed behind Elena with a soft click that seemed to release the tension that had held the entire mess hall in suspended animation. For several seconds, nobody moved or spoke, as if her departure had taken with it the gravity that had anchored everyone in place during the extraordinary encounter. Then, like a dam breaking, conversations erupted simultaneously from every corner of the room. Colonel Hartwell remained standing near the corner table, his experienced mind still processing the implications of what he had witnessed. In 30 years of military service, he had seen elite operators in action, but rarely had he observed someone demonstrate such complete mastery of a situation while maintaining absolute adherence to military standards and values. Elena's handling of the incident would become a case study in professional restraint and effective leadership. The 5 recruits stood in a loose cluster, each lost in private contemplation of how drastically their evening had diverged from their expectations. Buchanan stared at the door through which Elena had departed, trying to reconcile the woman who had just delivered a master class in military bearing with the person they had thought to intimidate through harassment and numerical superiority. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached the colonel with the careful demeanor of someone who understood that discretion was paramount in handling classified personnel. "Sir," he said quietly, I recommend that any official documentation focus on the training value of this incident rather than the specific techniques or background of the individual involved. Some operational details are better left unspecified in standard reports. Hartwell nodded thoughtfully, appreciating Rodriguez's understanding of the delicate balance required when special operations personnel interacted with regular forces. The incident would be documented as a successful intervention in inappropriate recruit behavior, with emphasis on the valuable lessons learned rather than the specific capabilities demonstrated by the responding individual. Master Sergeant Williams gathered the 5 recruits with a sharp gesture, his weathered face reflecting both disappointment in their behavior and satisfaction with the lesson they had received. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen enough military careers destroyed by poor judgment to understand the value of second chances. "You have been given an extraordinary opportunity to learn from your mistakes without suffering the career-ending consequences you deserved." Thornfield winced as he straightened up, the pain in his ribs serving as a constant reminder of how quickly their harassment had transformed into a demonstration of superior force. "Yes, Master Sergeant," he replied, his voice still hoarse from the impact to his solar plexus. "We understand that we were shown mercy we didn't earn and received education we desperately needed." Around the mess hall, small groups of personnel continued their hushed discussions about what they had witnessed. Senior Chief Martinez found himself fielding questions from younger sailors who had never encountered special operations personnel outside of movies and recruitment videos. The clinical efficiency with which Elena had neutralized multiple attackers while maintaining complete emotional control challenged many preconceptions about combat and professional military behavior. Kovac tested his legs gingerly, the numbness from Elena's sweep gradually fading as circulation returned to normal. The ease with which she had put him on the ground served as a humbling reminder that physical size and apparent strength meant nothing when facing someone with superior training and experience. His assumptions about combat effectiveness had been thoroughly shattered in the span of a few seconds. Hendricks stared at his hands, remembering how Elena's movements had seemed almost choreographed in their precision and economy. Every strike had accomplished exactly what she intended without wasted motion or excessive force. The fork that had threatened Ramirez remained on her tray, now just an ordinary eating utensil again, though its transformation into a precision weapon would haunt his dreams for weeks to come. Sergeant Clearwater approached the colonel with her incident report, though the document now seemed woefully inadequate to capture the complexity of what had transpired. "Sir," she said carefully, "I believe this should be classified as a training incident with emphasis on the positive outcomes achieved through professional intervention. The specific techniques employed are probably best described in general terms rather than technical detail." Colonel Hartwell accepted the report while his mind continued calculating the broader implications of Elena's presence on his base. Her casual interaction with his personnel suggested either a routine stopover or a mission profile that required integration with regular forces. Either possibility carried responsibilities for his command that extended beyond simple base security and into areas where he lacked complete information. Ramirez remained seated, his hands still trembling slightly as he replayed those terrifying moments when the fork had hovered inches from his eye. The memory would serve as a permanent reminder that his actions had consequences that extended far beyond his intentions. The woman who could have permanently disabled him had instead chosen to demonstrate restraint and provide a teaching moment that might save his career and his life in future encounters. The whispered conversations gradually shifted from shocked recounting of the incident to serious discussions about respect, professionalism, and the standard expected of military personnel. Elena's handling of the situation had created ripple effects that would influence behavior and attitudes throughout the base for months to come. Young soldiers would think twice before engaging in harassment, knowing that their targets might possess capabilities far beyond their appearance suggested. Buchanan finally found the courage to approach Master Sergeant Williams directly, his face reflecting genuine remorse and determination to change. "Master Sergeant," he said quietly, I want to understand how to become the kind of soldier who earns respect through competence and character rather than demanding it through intimidation. What we did tonight was wrong on every level, and I need to learn how to be better." Williams studied the young man's expression, looking for signs of genuine commitment versus temporary embarrassment. The sincerity in Buchanan's voice suggested that Elena's lesson had penetrated deeper than simple fear of consequences. "That's the right question," he replied approvingly. "Respect is earned through consistent demonstration of values, competence, and integrity. Tonight you learned what happens when you fail to meet those standards, but more importantly, you saw what they look like when properly embodied." The colonel surveyed the mess hall one final time, noting how the atmosphere had shifted from the usual casual dinner conversations to more serious discussions about military values and professional standards. Elena's brief presence had elevated the discourse and created teaching moments that would benefit every person who had witnessed her demonstration of proper military bearing under pressure. As the formal aspects of the incident concluded, personnel began returning to their meals and normal activities, though the conversations remained more thoughtful and the behavior more professional than usual. The 5 recruits would spend the remainder of the evening reflecting on their mistakes and planning how to demonstrate the lessons they had learned through their future actions and attitudes. 3 hours after Elena's departure, the mess hall had finally returned to something resembling normal operations, though the conversations remained distinctly different from the usual casual banter. Groups of personnel clustered around tables, their discussions focused on professionalism, respect, and the sobering reminder that assumptions about fellow service members could prove catastrophically wrong. Private First Class Jessica Chun, who had witnessed the entire encounter from across the room, found herself explaining the incident to her squad leader with an enthusiasm that reflected how profoundly the demonstration had affected her understanding of military excellence. "Sergeant," she said earnestly, "it wasn't just the physical techniques, though those were incredible. It was how she maintained complete professionalism throughout the entire situation, even when they were harassing her and even after she had neutralized the threat." Sergeant First Class Michael Torres nodded thoughtfully as he absorbed Chen's account, recognizing the educational value of what his soldiers had observed. The fact that none of the recruits required medical attention despite facing someone with Elena's capabilities spoke to a level of restraint and precision that exemplified the highest standards of military professionalism. "This is exactly the kind of example we should be setting for our own conduct," he replied. In the corner where the confrontation had occurred, maintenance staff worked quietly to restore the table and chairs to their proper positions, though several personnel had already requested that the area be designated as an informal memorial to professional excellence. The spot where Elena had sat would be remembered by everyone present as the place where they witnessed true military bearing under pressure. Colonel Hartwell returned to his office with Master Sergeant Williams. Their conversation focused on how to incorporate the evening's events into ongoing training programs without compromising operational security or revealing classified information about Elena's background. The incident had provided a perfect case study in multiple aspects of military conduct, from the consequences of inappropriate behavior to the demonstration of proper restraint and professionalism. "Sir," Williams said as they reviewed the incident documentation, "I believe we should develop a training module based on tonight's events. Obviously, we'll need to sanitize the specific details about the individual involved, but the lessons about respect, situational awareness, and professional conduct are invaluable for our personnel at every level." The 5 recruits had been escorted to a conference room where they spent the remainder of the evening writing detailed accounts of their actions and the lessons they had learned. Buchanan's report filled 3 pages with honest self-assessment and specific commitments to behavioral change. His writing reflected genuine understanding that their harassment had violated not just military regulations, but fundamental human dignity. Thornfield's account focused on the moment when he had grabbed Elena's shoulder, recognizing it as the precise instant when their inappropriate behavior had crossed into criminal assault. The memory of her final warning and his decision to ignore it would serve as a permanent reminder that actions have consequences that extend far beyond immediate intentions or perceived power dynamics. Hendricks wrote extensively about the disconnect between Elena's appearance and her capabilities, using his experience to explore the dangerous assumptions that had led to their confrontation. His report emphasized how their preconceptions about gender, role, and combat effectiveness had blinded them to obvious signs that they were dealing with someone far outside their league. In the base's communication center, Senior Chief Martinez fielded calls from other installations whose personnel had heard whispered accounts of the evening's events through unofficial channels. The military's informal network ensured that stories of exceptional professionalism and dramatic lessons learned spread quickly through the service community, often becoming part of the oral tradition that shaped military culture. Kovac's reflection focused on the physical aspects of his encounter with Elena, analyzing how her movements had demonstrated principles of leverage, timing, and precision that contradicted everything he thought he knew about combat. His account would eventually be incorporated into hand-to-hand combat training, though with Elena's identity carefully obscured to protect operational security. Ramirez struggled to articulate the psychological impact of having a weapon positioned inches from his eye by someone who could have blinded him instantly, but chose restraint instead. His writing explored themes of mercy, professional discipline, and the responsibility that came with possessing superior capabilities. The experience had fundamentally altered his understanding of what it meant to be a professional soldier. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez found himself in high demand as personnel sought more information about Elena's background and the significance of her ghost call sign. His carefully worded responses respected operational security while providing enough context for younger soldiers to understand that they had witnessed something extraordinary that deserved serious reflection. The base's training officer, Captain Sarah Mitchell, began drafting a comprehensive program that would use the evening's events as a foundation for discussions about respect, professionalism, and the dangerous consequences of harassment and assault. The curriculum would emphasize positive examples of military bearing, while using the recruit's experience as a cautionary tale about poor judgment and assumptions. Throughout the base, the story continued to evolve as each retelling added new layers of detail and interpretation. Elena's demonstration had become more than just an incident. It had transformed into a teaching tool that would influence military culture and individual behavior for years to come. Young soldiers would learn that every person deserved respect regardless of appearance or perceived role. As the evening shift took over mess hall operations, the incoming personnel immediately sensed the changed atmosphere. The usual casual conversations had been replaced by more serious discussions about military values and professional standards. Several tables displayed impromptu study groups where soldiers discussed leadership principles and the importance of treating every individual with dignity and respect. The 5 recruits completed their written accounts as midnight approached, each document serving as both confession and commitment to fundamental change in their attitudes and behavior. Their experience would become part of their permanent military education, a constant reminder that character and professionalism were not optional aspects of military service, but essential requirements for anyone who wore the uniform. Colonel Hartwell reviewed the final reports while considering how to share the lessons learned without compromising the operational security that surrounded Elena's presence. The incident had provided his base with a masterclass in military excellence that would benefit every person under his command, creating a legacy of professionalism that would outlast any individual assignment or rotation. The following morning arrived with unseasonable clarity, as if the previous evening's events had somehow purified the very atmosphere around the base. Colonel Hartwell stood at his office window, watching the morning formation assemble with noticeably improved precision and military bearing. Word of the mess hall incident had spread through every unit, creating an overnight transformation in how personnel conducted themselves and interacted with their fellow soldiers. At 0800 hours, an encrypted communication arrived on the colonel's secure terminal that would provide the final piece of the puzzle surrounding Elena's presence at his facility. The message bore classification markings that required him to clear his office of all personnel before opening the transmission. What he read in the following minutes would complete his understanding of exactly who had graced his mess hall with her presence. Staff Sergeant Elena Castellanos, call sign Ghost, had not simply been passing through his base on routine travel. She was conducting a classified assessment of base security, personnel conduct, and readiness standards as part of a broader evaluation program that tested military installations across multiple theaters. The previous evening's incident had provided her with more comprehensive data about his facility's culture and leadership than months of formal inspections could have revealed. The communication included Elena's complete service record, a document so heavily redacted that it resembled an abstract art piece more than a personnel file. What remained visible painted a picture of an operator whose career included missions that read like fiction but were documented as historical fact. 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Silver Stars, and a Navy Cross told only the beginning of a story that extended into classified operations across 4 continents. Colonel Hartwell leaned back in his chair as the implications settled over him like a heavy blanket. Elena had not just happened to be eating dinner when 5 recruits decided to demonstrate their ignorance and poor judgment. She had been observing, evaluating, and documenting the very behavior that they had chosen to display. Their harassment had provided her with a perfect case study of the challenges facing military discipline and respect standards. In the barracks, the 5 recruits prepared for what they expected to be a day of reckoning. Buchanan had slept poorly, his dreams filled with images of Elena's calm precision as she neutralized their aggression without breaking stride. He understood now that their actions had been observed and judged by someone whose opinion carried weight far beyond their unit or even their base. Thornfield moved gingerly as he dressed, his ribs still tender from Elena's precisely delivered elbow strike. The pain served as a constant reminder of how quickly their harassment had been transformed into a demonstration of superior force and discipline. More importantly, it reminded him that he owed his continued military career to Elena's restraint and professionalism. Master Sergeant Williams received his own classified briefing at 0830, learning for the first time the true scope of what his personnel had witnessed. Elena's assessment would become part of a comprehensive evaluation that would influence training programs, leadership development, and conduct standards across the entire military structure. The 5 recruits had unknowingly participated in a test that would affect thousands of soldiers. The revelation that Elena had been conducting an official evaluation added new dimensions to her handling of the situation. Her decision to transform harassment into a teaching moment, rather than simply documenting disciplinary failures, demonstrated the kind of leadership and judgment that distinguished truly exceptional military professionals from ordinary soldiers who simply followed orders and procedures. At 0900, Colonel Hartwell called a general assembly in the base's main auditorium. Personnel filed in with the mixture of curiosity and apprehension that accompanied unscheduled gatherings, though many suspected the meeting would address the previous evening's extraordinary events. The auditorium filled quickly as word spread that the colonel had important information to share about recent developments. Buchanan and his 4 companions sat together in the front row, their presence there the result of specific instructions rather than personal choice. They faced the assembled personnel with the knowledge that their actions had created consequences that extended far beyond their own careers and reputations. The weight of collective judgment pressed down on them as hundreds of eyes focused on their section. Colonel Hartwell took the podium with the bearing of someone who was about to deliver information that would change how everyone present understood their service and responsibilities. Last night, he began, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the auditorium. This base was visited by an individual whose presence provided us with an extraordinary opportunity to demonstrate our values, professionalism, and commitment to the standards that define military excellence. The silence in the auditorium was absolute as personnel waited for details about what many had heard described in whispered conversations throughout the morning. The colonel's formal tone suggested that official information was about to replace the speculation and rumors that had circulated since Elena's departure. Even those who had not witnessed the incident personally understood that something significant had occurred. Without compromising operational security or revealing classified information, Hartwell continued, I can tell you that we were evaluated by someone whose judgment carries considerable weight in determining how our military maintains its standards of conduct and professionalism. The behavior demonstrated by some of our personnel and the response provided by our evaluator will influence training and policy decisions that affect our entire service. The 5 recruits felt the weight of hundreds of stares as the implications of the colonel's words sank in throughout the auditorium. They had not simply harassed a fellow soldier during dinner. They had failed a test whose results would be studied by senior leadership and used to shape the future of military culture and discipline standards. Elena's assessment report, currently being compiled in a secure facility hundreds of miles away, would praise the base's overall professionalism while highlighting specific areas for improvement. Her recommendations would emphasize the need for enhanced training on respect, situational awareness, and the dangerous consequences of assumptions based on appearance or perceived status. The colonel's next words would transform the 5 recruits from symbols of failure into examples of the military's capacity for redemption and growth. However, he continued, this evaluation also demonstrated our institution's ability to learn from mistakes and grow stronger through adversity. The individuals involved in last night's incident have shown genuine remorse and commitment to change that reflects the best traditions of military service and personal development. As personnel absorbed this information, a new understanding began to emerge about the significance of what they had witnessed. Elena had not simply defended herself against harassment. She had conducted a masterclass in leadership, professionalism, and the transformation of negative situations into positive learning experiences that would benefit everyone involved. Colonel Hartwell paused as the auditorium doors opened with ceremonial precision, and Elena Castellanos entered wearing full dress uniform that told a story more complete than any words could convey. The rows of ribbons across her chest created a rainbow of military achievement that silenced the assembled personnel more effectively than any order for quiet. Each decoration represented missions, sacrifices, and accomplishments that most soldiers could only imagine. The 5 recruits in the front row felt their remaining composure crumble as they took in the full display of Elena's credentials. The Navy Cross gleamed prominently among her decorations, flanked by silver stars that caught the auditorium's overhead lighting and seemed to burn with their own internal fire. Purple Hearts spoke of wounds received in service to her country, while campaign ribbons told the story of a warrior who had served in every major conflict of the past decade. Master Sergeant Williams stood automatically as Elena approached the podium, his veterans' eye cataloging decorations that represented the highest levels of military achievement. Around the auditorium, personnel rose in waves as they recognized the significance of what they were seeing. The quiet woman who had eaten dinner alone in their mess hall was not just an elite operator, but a living legend whose service record read like a compilation of the military's greatest success stories. Elena moved to the podium with the same fluid grace that had characterized her movements during the previous evening's confrontation, though now her bearing carried the additional weight of formal recognition and official acknowledgement. Her dark eyes swept across the assembled personnel with calm assessment, taking in their shocked expressions and growing understanding of exactly who had been in their midst. Colonel Hartwell stepped aside respectfully, yielding the platform to someone whose rank might be lower, but whose achievements and authority transcended traditional military hierarchy. The formal transfer of speaking position felt like a ceremony in itself, acknowledging that some individuals earned the right to address assemblies through actions rather than appointments. Personnel throughout the auditorium struggled to reconcile the woman before them with their preconceptions about military excellence and combat effectiveness. Her modest stature seemed impossible to square with stories of single-handed missions behind enemy lines and combat achievements that had become legendary within special operations communities. Elena began speaking without notes or preparation, her voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to briefing senior leadership on matters of national importance. Yesterday evening, she said, 5 members of your command made assumptions about my role, capabilities, and right to respect based on my appearance and their perception of military hierarchy. Their behavior provided a perfect case study of the challenges facing our military culture. Buchanan felt tears threatening as the full weight of Elena's words settled over him. They had not simply harassed a fellow soldier. They had assaulted someone whose service to their country exceeded anything he could hope to achieve in multiple lifetimes. The shame that washed over him was so intense it felt physical, like a weight pressing down on his chest and making breathing difficult. However, Elena continued, their subsequent response to correction, their willingness to accept responsibility, and their genuine commitment to change demonstrates the military's greatest strength, our ability to learn from mistakes and emerge stronger than before. Their experience will now serve as education for thousands of soldiers across multiple commands. Thornfield's hand moved unconsciously to his ribs, where Elena's precise strike had taught him the difference between perceived strength and actual capability. The pain had faded, but the lesson remained permanently etched in his memory. He understood now that he owed not just his continued military career, but possibly his life, to Elena's restraint and professionalism. Around the auditorium, personnel absorbed the revelation that they had witnessed not just an exceptional demonstration of combat skills, but an official evaluation that would influence military policy and training for years to come. Elena's assessment would recommend enhanced programs focused on respect, situational awareness, and the dangerous consequences of assumptions based on appearance or gender. Elena's next words addressed the broader implications of what had occurred, transforming a local incident into a lesson with universal application. Every person who wears this uniform, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent auditorium, represents not just themselves but the values and standards that define military service. Respect is not optional. Professionalism is not negotiable. Dignity is not dependent on rank, role, or appearance. The 5 recruits found themselves standing without conscious decision, their bodies responding to some instinct that demanded they show proper respect for someone whose achievements dwarf their own understanding of military excellence. Around them, the entire auditorium rose in recognition of Elena's service and the lesson she had provided through her handling of their inappropriate behavior. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez felt a mixture of pride and humility as he watched Elena address the assembly. His identification of her as Ghost had been based on whispered stories and unofficial recognition, but seeing her full credentials displayed publicly validated everything he had heard about her legendary status within special operations communities. Elena's final words to the assembly would become part of base tradition, quoted in training sessions and leadership development programs for years to come. She spoke about the responsibility that came with wearing the uniform, the importance of treating every individual with dignity and respect, and the understanding that assumptions could prove not just embarrassing but dangerous in real-world situations. The ceremony concluded with Elena's departure, though she paused at the auditorium doors to exchange salutes with Colonel Hartwell and the assembled senior personnel. The gesture carried profound significance, acknowledging both her elite status and her respect for the institutional structure that had enabled her extraordinary service. As personnel filed out of the auditorium, conversations focused entirely on the lessons learned and the profound privilege they had experienced in witnessing military excellence demonstrated at the highest level. The 5 recruits remained seated long after the assembly concluded, absorbing the full impact of their encounter with greatness and their opportunity for redemption through changed behavior. Elena's visit would be remembered as a defining moment in the base's history, a demonstration of how military values could transform negative situations into positive learning experiences that strengthened the entire community. Her legacy would live on in enhanced respect, improved professionalism, and the understanding that every person deserved dignity regardless of their apparent role or status. 6 months later, The corner table in the mess hall had been formally designated as the Respect and Professionalism Memorial, though everyone simply called it Ghost's Table. A small brass plaque mounted discreetly on the wall bore Elena's call sign and the date of her visit, serving as a permanent reminder of the lessons learned and the transformation that had followed her 30-second demonstration of elite military capabilities. Buchanan approached the table with the careful reverence of someone visiting a shrine, carrying his dinner tray with hands that no longer trembled when he remembered that evening. His transformation over the intervening months had been remarkable, progressing from a cocky recruit with poor judgment to a respected team leader whose conduct exemplified the values Elena had taught through her actions rather than her words. The 5 former antagonists had become the base's most vocal advocates for respect and professionalism, their personal experience lending credibility to their message that could not be achieved through regulations or formal training alone. Their story had spread throughout the military community, becoming a cautionary tale that prevented countless similar incidents at installations around the world. Thornfield wore sergeant stripes now, his promotion earned through consistent demonstration of the leadership and character that Elena's lesson had awakened in him. The pain in his ribs had faded within days, but the understanding of what it meant to show restraint and mercy to those who deserved neither had become a defining principle of his military service. Elena's assessment report had resulted in sweeping changes to military training programs, with enhanced emphasis on respect, situational awareness, and the dangerous consequences of assumptions based on appearance or perceived status. Her recommendations had been implemented across all branches of service, creating a cultural shift that would influence military conduct for generations. Colonel Hartwell's command had received commendation for its exemplary response to the incident and the positive changes that had followed Elena's visit. The base had become a model facility for professional development and respect training, with personnel from other installations visiting regularly to observe and learn from the transformation that had occurred. Master Sergeant Williams used the incident as a cornerstone of his leadership development courses, though Elena's identity remained classified and her specific techniques were described only in general terms. The lessons about character, professionalism, and the importance of treating every individual with dignity had proven universally applicable regardless of rank, role, or background. Hendricks had discovered a talent for training that might never have emerged without Elena's intervention in his trajectory toward disciplinary action and early discharge. His programs on assumption awareness and respect had become mandatory curriculum at military training facilities, preventing countless young soldiers from making the same mistakes that had nearly ended his career. The mess hall itself had undergone subtle but significant changes, with enhanced lighting and improved seating arrangements that eliminated isolated corners where harassment could occur unobserved. More importantly, the cultural transformation had created an atmosphere where inappropriate behavior was immediately challenged by fellow personnel rather than ignored or tacitly encouraged. Kovac's technical skills had found new purpose in developing training simulators that helped soldiers recognize and respond appropriately to harassment situations. His programs emphasized intervention techniques and bystander responsibility, creating a community approach to maintaining professional standards that extended far beyond individual conduct. Ramirez had become the base's most effective recruiter, his personal story of transformation and redemption resonating with young people who might otherwise have made similar mistakes. His presentations at high schools and colleges across the region emphasized respect, character, and the life-changing opportunities available to those who embraced military values. Elena's influence extended beyond the 5 individuals who had directly experienced her instruction. Personnel throughout the base reported improved morale, enhanced sense of purpose, and greater pride in their service. The understanding that they might encounter exceptional individuals in unexpected circumstances had created a culture of respect that benefited everyone. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been promoted to instructor status, his ability to recognize elite operators making him valuable for security training and threat assessment education. His identification of Elena as Ghost had become part of military legend, demonstrating the importance of situational awareness and respect for fellow service members. The base's annual Professionalism Day had been established to commemorate Elena's visit and the lessons learned from the incident. The ceremony included presentations from the 5 former recruits, discussions of military values, and recognition of personnel who exemplified the standard Elena had demonstrated through her restraint and professionalism. Sergeant Clearwater's incident report had become required reading at military leadership schools, praised for its careful balance of operational security concerns with educational value. Her documentation had preserved the lessons learned while protecting the classified details surrounding Elena's mission and capabilities. As evening approached, the mess hall filled with personnel whose conduct reflected the lasting impact of Elena's brief presence among them. Conversations remained respectful, interactions demonstrated genuine consideration for others, and the atmosphere embodied the professional standards that defined military excellence at its finest. The corner table where Elena had sat remained empty by tradition during dinner hours, reserved for reflection and remembrance of the evening when 5 young soldiers learned the difference between perceived strength and actual capability. The brass plaque caught the overhead lighting, its simple inscription serving as a permanent reminder that assumptions could prove catastrophically wrong. Colonel Hartwell's final report on the long-term effects of Elena's assessment had concluded with a recommendation that similar evaluation programs be expanded throughout the military structure. The combination of undercover observation and direct intervention had provided insights into military culture that could not be achieved through conventional inspection methods. If this story moved you, share your thoughts about your favorite moment or character, or tell us about someone you know who showed hidden strength when cornered. Elena's legacy lived on in the transformed lives of 5 soldiers who had learned that respect was not optional, professionalism was not negotiable, and dignity was not dependent on rank, role, or appearance. Their story continued to inspire military personnel around the world, proving that even the worst mistakes could become opportunities for growth when met with wisdom, restraint, and the commitment to become better than you were before.